Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of the Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Now, I've often stated on this program that it takes collaborative approaches to attain any measure of housing equality and social justice. You have to have your foot soldiers, those individuals that stand on the front lines bringing awareness to the injustices suffered by many. It takes community benefit organizations that work in a tactical capacity, developing programs that provide access to housing for those individuals that would otherwise not have that access. It also takes legislators to develop laws and ensure fair treatment in housing. And once those laws are enacted, it takes an enforcement agency like the PHRC to ensure that violators of these laws are held accountable. Which brings us to our guest today. Samuel Rivera, Esquire, serves as Chief Counsel for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, where he's tasked with protecting the civil rights of the people of the Commonwealth by enforcing state and federal laws that prohibit discrimination in employment, education, public accommodation, and of course, housing. Welcome, Chief Counsel, to PHRC Speaks, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Director Garcia, and I'm humbled by the opportunity and the privilege, and I thank you for your kind words. I really do.
Well, you know, the one thing I didn't mention, just in total transparency, I try to be as transparent as possible, right, is that we both come from the same neighborhood, man. Both Bridgeport boys up here trying to make a difference.
Right. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's always comforting to be with folks that know and understand being way back home back in the day. Yeah. Absolutely. So speaking of way back home back in the day, and as I've said to many other leaders that I've had on the program, it's not as if we wake up someday and we just say, I'm gonna do social justice, right? It kind of happens gradually. So I want to give our audience kind of a snapshot of how you got into this social justice journey that led you to the PHRC. What can you tell us about that? Great question, Director Garcia. And I think I would sort of, start off by saying mine is probably the road less traveled. There's sort of a unique path in terms of my social justice journey. As you know, as a young kid coming up in Bridgeport, I was living in the projects, and there's a lot of folks now, I don't know if that's a pejorative term or not, but, as you know, housing for low-income residents or subsidized housing. And so I know historically in the 20th century, this was sort of the public housing project. As you know, these were sort of buildings that were brick and that weren't really appealing to the site. There were large buildings that really housed a lot of individuals that could not, like it's my case of my family, could not afford traditional housing. And so I had a lot of extended family, aunts, my grandmothers all lived in subsidized housing in the projects. And so at a young age, I learned really having to help my parents interpret and making sure things fell appropriately. And my siblings also helped in that task too. And as you know, there's sort of had that stigma with dealing with living in the projects, or sort of those things that sort of come, or these preconceived notions that come with having subsidized housing. So really, my roots in terms of an advocate really started there, helping my parents who faced a lot of obstacles, because as you know, I don't hold these facts back, that my parents were not educated, could not speak English, and so to a large extent, myself and my siblings had to serve as advocates for our parents and having to sort of do what's right. And shortly after high school, I joined the military and served 4 years, and then I ended up going to college and law school. And really, my legal career, it's not on my resume, but actually started sort of your neck of the woods. One of my first jobs as being a licensed practicing attorney was at the Lancaster Legal Services. And there I was engaged in doing work of landlord-tenant cases, sort of challenging landlords for not providing services or cutting off services or wrongfully trying to evict individuals from their housing. And so this is kind of near and dear to my heart in terms of where I started and where I began. And so after doing a short stint at Lancaster Legal Services, I really spent the next over 20 years really advocating for the rights of the accused, really pushing the envelope in terms of protecting the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment against government encroachment, if you will. It was shortly after that when I transitioned out of my private practice that I really saw an opportunity that really spoke to me, which was working for, as you pointed out, the University of Connecticut School of Law, the Center for Children's Advocacy. I was head of the Racial Justice Project, and there, as you I think artfully pointed out, we were challenging those systems of inequities, right? So those systems that are sort of unfortunately target children of youth, right? Children of color, rather, in terms of how they're treated in the educational system, the juvenile justice system, and really advocating for reform policies and change, right, in the face of insidious discrimination, right? And so after I transitioned from that position in Connecticut, I wanted to make my way back to Pennsylvania, and I saw this opportunity to work at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I thought to myself, I said, look, what better way? I said, I've always found that the two most important attorneys, and again, this is my opinion, are those who are on the battlefield, those who are sort of advocating and pushing, right? Those who are protecting our constitutional liberties, our civil rights. And I thought this was, a logical next step, something that I wanted to do, something that I was passionate and committed about. And what better way of advocating and fighting against all forms of discrimination than being really at the agency who's tasked with that responsibility. So I was extremely appreciative and honored that our executive director gave me that opportunity to do that. And as such, now I find myself sort of leading the legal division, protecting the agency, protecting the commissioners, the executive director, and really the citizens of the Commonwealth in terms of enforcing and executing and doing what's necessary to fight any form of discrimination for the people of the Commonwealth.
That's excellent. And you mentioned housing and growing up in public housing, subsidized housing. And I want to kind of put a follow-up to that at this point, put a pin on it, if you will, because few people don't realize how housing affects education, how it affects your social standing in the eyes of others that are looking towards you or inward, right? Like if you're on the outside of the housing projects, you're looking into those and you're formulating opinions and you're formulating their future without even knowing who lives there, right? And so what we have found, and one of the things that we're studying at the PHRC, is that correlation between housing and education. And is that kind of what you find? I mean, obviously you worked with children that were in the system or were put in the system. Let's call it for what it is, that school to prison pipeline that you see. It comes from a neighborhood kind of feel. It's like it's a given that if you're in this neighborhood, you're going to end up X, Y, Z. Is that more or less how you saw it being interpreted?
Right, that's exactly it. I mean, you know the stigmatization that goes along with being in subsidized or public housing, and sort of all the things that sort of cascade from that, right? So you're typically in your inner city, right? You're in inner city youth are then really relegated to educational institutions that are underfunded or don't really have, in my estimation, teachers or administrators that are really invested in these children. Oftentimes when I was growing up, and this from Bridgeport, that we had teachers coming out from outside the district to teach us. So they saw this as a 9-to-5 job and really weren't invested in those children. So the reality, it's as you pointed out, really this housing really serves as sort of the fundamental underpinnings of how successful, in my mind, the kid's going to be, right? Because without that, I mean, if you can't secure housing for your family and for your children, you're having your electric cut off or your water, or you're being displaced. All those things are, as you know, going to contribute to the success of that child and that family and how well they're going to do. And I think to a large extent, that helps foster this sort of school to prison pipeline, unfortunately, which is the regrettable circumstances of that.
As we have that underpinning as foundation, I want to go into our discussion about what are some of the responsibilities. Kind of mentioned it top line, but what are some of the responsibilities of the chief counsel for the PHRC as it pertains to housing cases, or just in general for the PHRC? You kind of gave me the broad strokes. Can you give me a little bit of detail of what that's like?
Right, I can tell you it's a huge task. Anyone who's had this position knows. I mean, I think as the chief legal advisor to an agency that's really obligated to enforce all the anti-discrimination laws in Pennsylvania as it affects employment, public accommodation, education, but specifically, I mean, protecting the civil rights of people of the Commonwealth in the area of housing and what the interplay of that is. And I think so, since we're talking about housing, I'm going to sort of try to target that specifically, right? So when we're talking about housing discrimination, we're talking about the same protected classes that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers, as well as others that our federal counterpart may not, right? But when we talk about really the obligation or the responsibility, my responsibility is that I need to make sure that we're investigating and prosecuting those who violate our law on the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as its counterpart, the Fair Housing Act, right? And so oftentimes there's always this misunderstanding or this misnomer, if you will, that those two work independently. I would make the argument that they coexist, right? So provisions of our state law are really considered substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so with that, I think we are in a unique position to have sort of that broad umbrella to protect the citizens of the Commonwealth that face all types of discrimination, but particularly housing. And when we talk about housing, I'm invested obviously in all areas, but particularly with housing, we're looking at cases for failure to rent or failure to lease. We're looking at instances where there are lease agreements where there's really different terms and conditions, and we're looking at cases in which there's been a failure to accommodate, things that sort of jump out to you and me as director of housing, right, and me as chief counsel, that sort of we end up scratching our heads and sort of protecting those who are subject to eviction unlawfully or wrongfully, right? Those who are subject to harassment, right? And so for me as chief counsel is making sure we have that consistency and continuity across the state among our offices. And as a lot of folks know, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we have regional offices in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia. So there's something to be said about having consistency, continuity, and the strength of enforcing both the state and federal law as it relates to protecting individuals who are facing any types of discrimination in terms of housing law. Another thing I like to look at is, are we seeking and obtaining the appropriate remedy and relief for individuals who've been harmed, right? Because it's one thing to say, hey, we're going to investigate, but I've taken it as my obligation, my mission to make sure that our agency is fulfilling its mission in terms of getting those things that are crucial for folks who are, look, let's call it what it is. When you're talking about eviction, we're talking about someone who's going to be thrown out on the streets, someone who's not going to be able to care for their individual self, their family, their extended family. I mean, I can't think of something more egregious or something more harmful than that. Because when you talk about employment, you lose your job. That's true. But when you talk about losing your housing, where do you sleep? Where do you cook? Where do you get your meals for yourself and for your children, right? So for me, it's vitally important that we're doing the things that we need to in terms of, we know that, and I've known this as an advocate for a long time, that, you want to seek the path of least resistance. You want to be able to sort of resolve those cases that on their face appear to be obvious, blatant discrimination, to be able to resolve those cases through mediation agreement, some sort of agreement, or a conciliation agreement. But we need to be mindful that when we do that we're actually doing things that are necessary, that we're actually calling out to eliminate these either discriminatory practices or the conduct, right? And when we do that, we want to sort of make sure, investigators, attorneys, and the like, that we're doing the things that are necessary to make the client whole, right? So we're talking about damages, things that have happened to this person or families, right? But that we get them where they need to be. If it's monetary, that's one thing. If it's training for the respondent on sort of eradicating this discriminatory unlawful practice, we need to do that. Whether or not they're posting the fair practices notices, whether or not they need the trainings for us to go in there or get someone from the outside to give them the individual training that they need, and for us to sort of advance our mission. And really, in the end, as you know, Director Garcia, for me, it's making sure we serve justice, right? And so I know, your mantra is, and I don't want to misstate this, is, affirmatively advancing,
affirmatively furthering fair housing, yes.
Right. And I think if we do that, it's just not words, right? That we really want to put our mouth where it needs to be. We need to be able to practice what we preach, right? We need to be able to do that. So for me, in terms of investigating, in terms of trying to get a reasonable resolution, but in the end, when we're talking about prosecuting cases, we need to have more public hearings. We've had that discussion. We need to be able to demonstrate to landlords, to leaseholders, doesn't matter that we are not going to, take an easy look or easy position when it comes to discrimination. And the way we do that is by advocating, right? So one of the things that I miss in terms of when we talk about sort of where I started from is that I'm an advocate. I mean, it's hard sometimes to sort of manage because I want to jump in there in the fire. I want to be able to slay the demons. I want to slay the dragons. And sometimes that's hard to do. And so when we're talking about genuinely advocating and using our legal and adversarial process to demonstrate and eradicate and prove acts of discrimination, that's what we do. That's where the fun begins. If the aggrieved party comes to us and they say, hey, this landlord or this person, this development is discriminating against us, we need to take that challenge on. We need to take that challenge on with tenacity, with zeal, with the kind of advocacy that's necessary to push the needle. If we are going to be the state's leading agency in terms of furthering and enforcing our anti-discrimination laws, then we need to do that. We need to do that. We need to be able to show individuals, and this is not having no axe to grind, but this is talking about fundamental fairness. This is talking about due process. We're talking about obtaining all the remedies that the law provides to end insidious discrimination, right? And discriminatory conduct and discriminatory practices. And so for me, I think as the chief legal advisor, that's what we need to do. And so for me, I think it's not only making sure that the regional directors, our director of enforcement, that I'm working collaboratively with you, the director of housing, and that I'm working with all the individual attorneys to say, hey, listen, this is the point that we're not going to tolerate. This is the point that we're going to need necessarily show individuals who engage in this kind of conduct that we're not, the day's over. That it's a done deal now. We're going to take the steps necessary and appropriate to really remediate all this discrimination that's happening, as you know, on a daily basis.
No, I thank you for that, and certainly the passion jumps off the screen. I can tell that you're in it to win it, and your passion is showing through, and it's very much closely related to where you started, which was the landlord-tenant law. It's still, but now you're looking at a fundamental, what could be a fundamental disregard for fair housing, for anti-discrimination. In other words, it's looking at that nuance of the law. How have you found that to be different from what you did before? Is there a difference? I mean, I know that your position is different and that you're not in there slaying the dragons on a daily basis, but in a manner of speaking, you kind of are, because you're upstream.
Right. Excellent question. I mean, I found sort of you can't separate the advocacy, right? So for me, I'm still terribly offended when I see the things that I see, right? The kinds of complaints that you and I see on a daily basis, right? And for me, I think I take comfort now that working at an agency like the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, I have more tools at my disposal. So when we sort of pair off what I did in terms of landlord-tenant when I was an attorney at Lancaster Legal Services, there I was limited in scope in terms of what I can do. I was using basically the landlord-tenant law to sort of provide the remedies necessary. I find that we have a heavy hammer, right? We have the ability to enforce the law. We have the ability to subpoena witnesses and engage in discovery and really bring these individuals that are violating the law to the forefront. And so I find that the umbrella is wide enough that I think, in my mind's eye, leads to more advocacy, wanting sort of more like, hey, we can go on there. We have other protections. As you know, it's not just race, color, it's familial status, right? We can go after individuals in reality for not conforming with the law, right? And so I think the remedies that our act provides, right, either if you're talking about a dual file case in federal or state court, or a case that comes from the a HUD case, that the reality is that there's a lot of tools at our disposal. So I think I view my position now with greater strength. I can't do the level of advocacy in terms of direct representation I once did, but certainly I can inform, and I can model, and I can teach the attorneys within our office and investigators, everyone involved, that these are the things we should be trying to do. I mean, I think it's important, right? When we're talking about getting a public accommodation or getting those things that I previously talked about in terms of trying to resolve the case. But in the end, if we can't get those, we do what we're called to do. We go in there and fight and do what's necessary to serve justice.
No, I appreciate that. And I don't want to talk out of school, but I can tell you that I have certainly appreciated the way that since joining the PHRC, you believe in that self-accountability, not only how we hold those that may violate the PHRA and the Fair Housing Act or any of the other laws, but you also seek to hold the interior structure accountable, how we do things, what is the correct way of doing things, how we, because you're a steward of the taxpayer. You're making sure that the taxpayer is receiving the service and that we're doing everything according to statute. So I just want to point that out, that I've seen that in persona, as they say. And I want to ask you briefly, if you could share with us why you think that's important.
I think for some of the points you've articulated, Director Garcia, it's vitally important, right? Because the way we process cases, I mean, we need to sort of get away from that. These are cases, these are human beings, these are people, these are families, these are individuals that are going to really, I mean, what worse can happen to you being displaced from your home, not knowing where you're going to be able to seek shelter, where you're not going to be able to seek meals, right? And so for me, I think it's vitally important to sort of look and examine at the process. How can we better serve the people of the Commonwealth? And with that, having managers like yourself and others who are invested, who are dedicated, who understand the importance of what we're doing, is what we really need to examine. And just not examine, re-examine, right? So I think the benefit of managers like yourself and myself in terms of joining the agency is that we come from the outside. We can sort of look and see, okay, how can we improve on these processes that we're better serving? How can we internally get these cases moving quicker? How can we get these cases that we are showing a level of transparency, accountability, and we're trying to be as efficient as we possibly can in moving the needle in terms of eradicating discrimination. So I think it's vitally important. I think we need to continually to make those tweaks, modifications, and changes to help us serve the people of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned earlier having more tools at your disposal in your position here at the PHRC. And so I want to talk about one of those tools with the brief moments that I have left. The concept of prompt judicial action in housing discrimination cases. And without spilling the candy in the lobby, if you will, but talk to us about what that is. What is prompt judicial action, and how does it relate to cases that we may receive at the PHRC? I have a feeling that many of our audience may not be familiar with the extent of power that the PHRC may have in those cases. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Certainly. I think when we talk about prompt judicial action, we're really talking about the interplay of our law, right, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Fair Housing Act. And within both, we have the tools at our disposal to really seek prompt action, right? So when we're talking about prompt judicial action, I just want to sort of digress a little bit and really talk about what that really means, right? So typically what we're talking about is that someone's being evicted, right? And it's a discriminatory eviction. We've received information. We know something. The person, if it's an emotional support animal or whatever the respondent's predicating the condition of, but the individual coming to us has been harmed. It's a discriminatory eviction. And we're basically in a position now that they're going to suffer substantial harm. And as I said, these individuals are now looking to be out in the streets without having any resources, without, some of these people have extended families, right? Or they could just be a couple, it doesn't matter. And so we need and should be seeking ways in which we can get immediate relief. And that immediate relief, as you pointed out, is prompt judicial action. So that really comes in different forms. If we're talking about the federal system, you could seek what's termed under the law a temporary or a permanent injunction. All right, and so in our state system, the way that would work with us, if we get a complaint and we think we're in the process of investigating a discriminatory eviction, we're going to seek to go, and the attorneys are going to be tasked to going into the Court of Common Pleas, generally speaking, and requesting a stay, which is stopping the eviction proceedings, right? In asking the court, listen, Your Honor, or listen, as court such and such, we are in a position now that we need to stay. We need to stop this eviction proceeding because we need to complete our investigation, process this complaint, and reach a final determination, judgment, or adjudication, right? And so we're asking the court oftentimes, at least in state court and Court of Common Pleas, that we want to stay. And normally that stay falls into a temporary stay. Most courts won't make a permanent stay in state court. What they will do is they'll say, okay, once we're able to demonstrate the threshold findings that we need to demonstrate, which I don't want to sort of water this down with legal jargon.
Sure.
But once we're able to make that demonstration, really we're asking the court to say, listen, we need to put a temporary stop on this eviction. We don't want to displace this family or these individuals. We want to let this process play out. And generally speaking, you may get that, and the attorneys and the agency have been able to get several months to do that. And if we need to go back to court and ask for an extension of that, we'll be prepared to do that. But we need to use this as a crucial weapon, particularly now in COVID. And I know we had a lot of things happening and suspending payments, the moratoriums, all these different things happening. But I think even more so now, it's critically important that if we're receiving any discriminatory eviction claims, that we are prepared and ready to take action immediately. This doesn't mean we stay there. I mean, we obviously, as you know, we need to have investigators do their thing, right? They have to, have the sufficient information, sufficient documentation to support at least a threshold finding. So when the attorneys go to court, they can say, listen, Your Honor, we need this. We need a temporary stay. And so when we're talking about prompt judicial action, that's exactly what it is. We're doing it post haste. We're doing it immediately. We're going in there once we've marshaled enough evidence to go into court and say, Your Honor, we need to stop this right now until we let this discrimination complaint play out. And so I think, the more we do that, the more we push the envelope, the more success we're likely to see.
Excellent. Well, like all good things, time flies when you're having fun. I want to thank you for being with us on PHRC Speaks. I certainly am enjoying the work that we're doing together, and I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you, Director Garcia. It was a pleasure. It was an honor, and I really enjoyed having the boys back from the neighborhood talking to one another. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
For more information, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in housing, you can visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov, or you can call us at 717-787-9780. We're also pretty easy to find online on Facebook. You can find us at PA Human Relations, and on Twitter, we are PA_HumRelCom. That's going to do it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.